Roy Sims froze with his hand still on the iron gate, breath caught somewhere between his throat and his chest, because there in the pale grey light of a Tuesday morning sat the old black Labrador, muzzle white as frost, waiting on the wrong side of a fence she had no business knowing how to reach. "Girl," he whispered, "who let you back in?" She looked up at him, and her eyes said something he wasn't ready to hear. "Before we go any further, tell me down in the comments what part of the world you're listening from, and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss another story like this one." The morning was cold for late September in Harmon Falls, Ohio. A fog had settled low over the flat farmland outside town, and the gravel path leading up into Millbrook Cemetery still shone with dew. Roy had unlocked those gates every workday for 22 years, and in all that time, he had never once found anything on the inside that hadn't been there when he closed up the night before. Not a squirrel, not a stray cat, not so much as a lost baseball. The county had put those tall iron pickets around Millbrook back in 1968, and the fence had done its job for more than half a century. But there sat Bess, straight-backed as a soldier, waiting on the north side of the drive as though she had an appointment to keep. Roy knelt down slowly, careful not to startle her. She wasn't frightened. She never had been, not once in the 3 weeks since she had first appeared on the outside of the gate. She let him put his palm on her broad head. Her fur was damp from the fog, and her hips trembled when she stood, the arthritis catching her the way it caught his own knees. "How'd you get in here, huh?" Roy murmured. "You didn't fly, and I know you didn't dig because I checked." She only looked past him, up the gravel path, in the direction she was already impatient to go. He let her. She turned left at the old oak the way she always did, past the Mendez family plot with its 5 stone lambs in a row, up the slope toward the northeast corner where the ground still had that raw, unsettled look of a plot dug only weeks before. Walter Greer. Born 1961. Died August of that year. Beloved father, the marker read, and after that, only silence. Bess made her tight, careful circle around the headstone. Then she folded her old body down onto the earth beside it, tucked her nose between her front paws, and exhaled. A slow, long sound that made something inside Roy Sims's chest ache in a way he wasn't prepared for. He walked back to his office at the front of the cemetery and stood at the window a long time, watching her. He had told himself that first morning 3 weeks ago that she would give up and go home. She hadn't. She had come back the next day and the day after, and every day since. Roy had cleared the frost off her water bowl. He had left an old horse blanket by the oak in case she wanted it. She had never touched it. She only came for one thing, and that thing was on top of the ground and under it at the same time. But this morning was different. This morning she had gotten past the fence. Roy scratched the back of his neck and tried to work out how. The side gate near the maintenance shed had a chain and a padlock he checked every night. The main gate stayed closed after 5 o'clock. The fence was 7 feet tall and topped with pickets sharp enough to keep out the deer. There was no ditch under it, no hole in the wire. Somebody had opened that gate before he got there, and somebody had closed it behind her, and the padlock was hanging from the chain, the same way he always hung it. Only Roy Sims hadn't been the one to hang it that morning. Something in the corner of his eye moved. A woman was standing at the front fence. She was maybe 40, in a long tan coat that didn't belong to the country. Her hair was pulled back in a way that said she hadn't slept, or maybe hadn't had time to do more than tie it. She had one gloved hand resting on the top of the iron gate, the way a person rests a hand on a horse's neck, gently, not sure yet what the animal's going to do. Roy walked out to meet her. "Morning," he said. "I'm sorry," the woman answered. "I know you don't open until 7. It's 5 past. You're welcome." She looked past him, up the drive, at the small, dark shape under the oak. "That's my father's dog," she said quietly. Roy felt the pieces begin to move. "You'd be Miss Greer then?" Claire. Yes. Roy nodded and shifted the ring of keys on his belt. Bess had heard the voices. Her head lifted from her paws, and even at this distance Roy could see her body come alert in a way he hadn't seen before. She got to her feet slowly, the way old dogs do, one back leg first, then the other, and she stood beside the headstone with her nose pointed toward the gate. "She knows me," Claire said. Her voice caught on the word. "Reckoned she might." Claire took a step, then stopped. "Would it be all right if I went up?" "Ma'am, you don't have to ask me for that." She pushed the gate open, and the old hinges gave the same long complaint they had given every morning of Roy's working life. Bess didn't come running. She waited by the stone. Claire walked up the drive with slow, careful steps, the way a person walks who isn't sure yet whether she deserves to be there. Roy stayed back. He watched Claire kneel down beside her father's grave. He watched her rest one gloved hand on Bess's back and the other flat on the cold ground. He couldn't hear a word, but Claire's shoulders started to shake in a way he recognized, and it wasn't the shaking of a stranger, and it wasn't the neat, dry grief of somebody who had already come to terms with something. It was the shaking of somebody who had come here to say things she had not been ready to say in August. Roy turned and walked back into his little office and closed the door softly behind him so she could have her privacy. He put the coffee on. 20 minutes later, when he stepped out again with 2 paper cups, she was still there. He walked up the path. He set the second cup on the grass, a polite distance away from her. "Thought you could use it," he said. She looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes, and she was young, he realized, younger than he had first thought, not more than 38. She had her father's cheekbones and her father's habit of pressing her lips together when she didn't want somebody to see them tremble. "Thank you," she said. Roy hesitated. "Can I ask a question that isn't my business?" "Please." "How did she get inside the fence this morning?" Claire looked at Bess. Bess had not moved from her position beside the stone. "I let her out of my car," Claire said. "I drove her here. I was going to walk her up, and then I saw her, the way she looked up the path, and I didn't have the heart to hold her leash back. She went to the side gate. I thought it was locked. I was going to catch up to her and... Well, but by the time I got there, the padlock was already hanging open." Roy went cold. "Ma'am, I hung that lock myself last night. I hung it the way I hang it every night. I'd bet my paycheck on it." She looked up at him. "Well," she said, "somebody opened it then." Roy walked with Claire back to the little office, and Bess followed, matching Claire's pace step for step. Roy pulled the padlock down off its hook on the pegboard by the door. It was a heavy brass thing, thick as a man's thumb, with the county seal stamped into it. He turned it over in his hands. There was no scratch, no pry mark, no sign that anybody had forced it. It was a good lock. It had been a good lock for 8 years. "Somebody's got a key," Roy said. "Who has keys?" "Me. My assistant Bo, that's Bo Renner. He's over in Fostoria this week helping his sister move house. The funeral home has one for after-hours arrangements, and that's it, was it? I mean, until this morning." Claire watched Bess drink from a shallow bowl of water Roy set down. "Could somebody have taken one?" she asked. "Nobody who works here has died, if that's what you mean, and I'd know if a key went missing. I hang them on the same hook every night." "Then it's the funeral home." "Could be. Or somebody's had a key nobody knew about." Roy looked at her. "For how long?" "I don't know," she said. "I don't know anything about my father's last few years. That's why I'm here." She said it plainly, without pity for herself, and it landed on Roy like the kind of confession people used to make in the days when preachers wore ties. He said gently, "Would you tell me what you mean by that?" She looked out the window at Bess, who was now stretched out on the concrete step of the office door in a patch of thin sunlight. "My father and I," she said, "hadn't spoken in almost 4 years. Roy pulled a plastic chair over and set it down for Claire, and she took it, and he leaned against his desk, and for a while neither of them said anything. Bess sighed heavily on the concrete step outside. "He wasn't a bad man," Claire said finally. "I want you to know that. Whatever people around here told you about him, he wasn't a bad man. They told me he was a quiet fellow who kept to himself and paid his bills on time. Ran a small tree service for 40 years, went to the diner on Saturdays. Nobody said a bad word about him, Mum." She nodded and pressed a knuckle under one eye. "That's who he was. That's who he'd always been. And I stopped talking to him because I convinced myself he was somebody else." "What made you think that?" She hesitated a long moment. "After my mother died, she passed 6 years ago, cancer. My father was a wreck for a while. I stayed close. I came home most weekends. Then one of her sisters, my Aunt Diane, started telling me things. That Dad had been rougher on Mom than any of us knew. That there was money missing from Mom's family that he had touched. That he had begun seeing a woman before Mom was even in the ground. Diane said she was telling me for my own good, so I wouldn't be blindsided by anything. And you believed her. Not right away, but she kept saying it every phone call, every family dinner, little details, little proof. She'd say she saw Dad's truck outside that woman's trailer on Route 39 at 11 o'clock at night. She'd say Dad had been fighting with the lawyer about Mom's savings account, little things, things that made me watch him different when I visited. And then he started to act strange with me, and I told myself it was because he had something to hide. When the truth was, he could feel me looking at him like a stranger, and it was breaking his heart." She stopped and pressed both palms to her face. "I stopped answering when he called. I told him not to come see me. I said terrible things over the phone that Christmas, 3 years ago last Christmas, and after that he didn't call anymore. And I told myself I was better off. I told myself I had drawn a healthy line. That's what people say now, isn't it? A healthy line." Roy handed her the box of tissues from his desk. "And now he's gone," Claire said. "And my Aunt Diane didn't so much as come to the funeral. And I have started to understand very slowly over the last 2 months that I lost my father because I listened to somebody who had reasons of her own to want us broken." "What kind of reasons?" Roy asked. "That's the part I'm still figuring out." Roy nodded slowly. "And Bess?" he said. "Where did she come into it?" Claire looked out the window at the old black dog on the step. "She wasn't his dog originally," Claire said. "She was mine." Roy set his coffee down. "I got her as a puppy when I was in college, 9 weeks old. Dad drove me the 2 hours out to the breeder in Worcester because I was too scared to make the trip alone. I named her Bess, after my grandmother. When I moved into my first apartment in Columbus, I couldn't keep her, no pets allowed, and Dad took her home. Just for a while, we said, just till I got settled. But I never did get a place that would take her. Every time I visited, she was so happy to see him, and he was so happy to see her, and I told myself she was where she belonged. That was almost 12 years ago. So she's your father's dog and yours?" "She's his," Claire said gently. "She was always his in the end. I know it. She just still remembers me." Roy looked out at Bess again. The old Labrador had lifted her head and was watching Claire through the office window with the kind of attention only a dog who has waited for a person can produce. "Well," Roy said, "she remembers you a lot." Claire went back to the graveside that afternoon and sat on the ground beside Bess for 2 hours, and when she stood up, her tan coat had grass stains on it that she did not bother to brush off. Roy watched from his office window and didn't disturb them. When she left, she promised to come back the following Saturday, and she did. And the Saturday after that. By the end of October, the arrangement had a shape to it. Claire drove up from Columbus on Saturday mornings and spent the day. She rented a small furnished room in the boarding house on Maple Street, run by an older widow named Ellen Baird, who baked bread on Fridays and asked no questions. Bess rode up with Claire in the passenger seat of her small red sedan. The moment the car turned into the cemetery lot, Bess sat up straight and pressed her damp nose to the window. Roy gave Claire a copy of the side gate key because it was easier than pretending he hadn't found her at 7 in the morning most days, and because Bess was going to find her way in either way. But the question of who else had a key stayed with Roy through October and into November, because Bess had come in through that gate on her own that first Tuesday morning, and Claire had not opened it, and nobody Roy could account for had opened it either. He mentioned it once to his assistant Beau Renner when Beau got back from Fostoria. "Yours has been on this hook the whole time," Roy said, holding up the key. "Mine's on my ring." Beau checked. "Yeah, right here. Funeral home." "I'll ask." Beau came back 2 days later and said the funeral home director, Mr. Halpin, had cross-checked the safe. Every key was accounted for. Nobody had been in the cemetery after hours in months. Roy stood at the window that evening after closing and looked out at the empty gravel drive and thought about it a long time. Then, the second week of November, he saw the young man. The morning was cold enough to see your breath, and Roy had come in early to grit the front walk before the funeral of a Mrs. Alma Cortland at 10 o'clock. He was standing on the porch of the little office with a bucket of salt in his hand when he saw a figure moving up the drive. It wasn't Claire. Claire drove a small red sedan and always parked in the lot. This person had come in on foot. He was tall and thin, wearing a canvas work coat that had been washed too many times, and he walked with his shoulders pulled up around his ears the way young men walk when they don't want to be looked at. Roy set the salt down. The young man reached the northeast corner and stopped beside Walter Greer's headstone. He didn't kneel, he didn't cry, so far as Roy could see. He only stood there, hands deep in his pockets, and after a long moment he took a single small object out of one pocket and set it on top of the stone. Then he stood there another minute, and then he turned and walked back the way he had come. He was almost to the gate before he noticed Roy. He stopped. Roy raised one hand slowly, palm open, the way you signal to a scared animal. "Morning," Roy said. The young man looked at him for a long moment. He was maybe 22, 23 at the most. He had a thin, honest kind of face, and his eyes were the tired eyes of somebody who had been carrying something heavy for a while. "I'm not supposed to be in here," the young man said. His voice was low and even. "I know. You're not in trouble, son. I have a key. I figured you might. Mind telling me where you got it?" He gave it to me. The young man's throat worked around the word. He didn't need to say who he was talking about. Both of them looked at the same headstone up the path. "Sit with me a minute," Roy said. "Coffee's on." The young man's name was Daniel Foley, but everybody who knew him well, he said, called him Danny. He was 23 years old and worked the graveyard shift at the machine parts warehouse out on the County Line Road. He lived in a rented room above the hardware store on Main Street. His mother was in a state facility in Zanesville. His father had been dead since Danny was 15. He had no brothers, no sisters, and no plans past the next paycheck. He had met Walter Greer 3 years ago, when he was 20, and drinking more than he could hold and sleeping in his car, which was how he described it, and Walter had found him one morning parked crooked in the lot behind Walter's tree service. Walter had knocked on the window, waited for him to sit up, handed him a thermos of coffee, and said only, "You want to eat something? Come on inside." That was how it had started. Walter had put him on the crew that same week. Danny had learned to climb trees and run a chainsaw and set up rigging that could bring down a 200-year-old sycamore in the right direction. He had earned a paycheck. He had rented that room above the hardware store. He had found, without ever quite understanding when it happened, that he was no longer sleeping in his car. "He never once told me he was helping me," Danny said. He was cupping the coffee cup with both hands, as though he was afraid he would spill it. "He never once said, 'Hey, I know what you were. Look what I've done for you.' He treated me like I was a man he already respected, and after a while I started acting like a man he could respect. I don't know how to say it any different than that. You don't need to say it any different, Roy said. He gave me the key to the side gate about a year ago. He said, if anything happens to me, you come and sit here. He said, don't tell my daughter. He said, she doesn't need to know about you. He said, some things are between men, and this is one of them. Roy was quiet. But she does need to know, Danny said. That's what I keep coming here for. I keep meaning to knock on her door. I keep meaning to say something, and then I don't. Why not? Because I don't want her to think I was somebody her father chose instead of her. Roy looked out the window. Claire's small red sedan was pulling into the lot. You didn't choose that, Roy said. He didn't either, and I don't think she'd think that if you told her. I'm not so sure. I am. He set the coffee down and looked at Roy, and Roy could see that he was working himself up to something. There's something else, Danny said. Go on. He gave me a box. Danny said the box was a small metal thing, about the size of a shoebox, painted olive green like old army surplus. Walter had brought it to him about 6 months before he died. He had set it on Danny's kitchen table without any ceremony. He had said, if I go before I can hand this over myself, you take it to my daughter, not to Diane, not to anybody else, to Claire. Directly. Danny had asked what was inside. Walter had said, everything I couldn't say out loud. Danny had asked why Walter didn't just take it to Claire himself. Walter had said, she won't take my calls. She wouldn't take a package from me either. She'd send it back or she'd throw it away without opening it. She won't be able to throw you away because she won't know who you are. Danny had asked what he was supposed to say when he handed it over. Walter had said, tell her he was sorry for what he never got a chance to explain. That had been in February. Walter had died in August. Danny had been carrying the box in the trunk of his car ever since the funeral, unable to make himself drive to Columbus. Roy leaned forward. You've had it this whole time. Yes, sir. And you didn't open it. He asked me not to. Roy thought about that for a long moment. Then he looked out the window at Claire, who was already coming up the path with Bess trotting stiffly at her side. Son, Roy said, the woman coming up that path right now is the reason he gave you that box. She's here. She's ready. And I think it's time. Danny went out to his car, a rusted-out sedan parked on the shoulder of the county road just outside the cemetery. And he came back carrying the small green metal box with both hands, the way a boy carries a birthday cake. Claire and Roy were standing together by the office door when he came up the drive. Claire saw him and stopped. Miss Greer, Danny said. Yes, my name is Daniel Foley. I worked for your father. She looked at the box in his hands and then up at his face, and Roy watched her lips press together the way they had the first morning. I've never heard of you, she said quietly. He didn't want anyone to. Why not? Danny took a breath. Because he thought if you knew he'd been keeping an eye on somebody like me, you'd feel like he had picked me over you. And he didn't. He didn't ever. He talked about you all the time. He kept your picture in his glove box. He kept the schedule of the community theater in Columbus in his kitchen drawer because you had a little part in a play 3 years ago, and he drove down to see it and sat in the back and left before the lights came up because he didn't want to make you uncomfortable. Claire went very still. He was there both nights. She didn't speak for a moment. He asked me to bring this to you, Danny said. He held out the box. He said it was everything he couldn't say out loud. She took it. Her hands were shaking. Bess pressed her side against Claire's leg, the way old dogs do when their people need holding up. I'm sorry it took me so long, Danny said. I didn't know how. Thank you, Claire whispered. Thank you. They stood there a moment longer, and then Roy, sensing that some kinds of moments are best carried a step or two out of public view, nodded toward the office. Y'all come inside, he said. There's coffee. Inside the office, Claire sat down at Roy's desk with the small green box in front of her. Danny took the other chair. Bess lay down on the concrete floor beside Claire and rested her chin on Claire's shoe. Claire ran her fingertips along the seam of the lid. "I don't know if I can open it in front of anybody," she said. "Then don't," Roy said. "We can step out, or you can take it somewhere else, whatever you need." She thought about it a long moment. "No," she said. "Stay. Please. He would have wanted somebody with me." She lifted the lid. Inside the box, neatly stacked, were envelopes, dozens of them. Roy counted from where he stood, at least 30, maybe more. Each one was sealed. Each one had a date written on the front in a careful, block-lettered hand. The oldest was labeled November, 4 years ago. The newest was dated August of that year. Claire pressed a hand to her mouth. "He wrote to me," she said, "the whole time." "He never sent them?" "He couldn't. I told him not to write me. That last phone call, I told him if he wrote, I would send the letters back unopened, and I meant it. He believed me." She reached in and took out the earliest one, the one dated November 4 years ago. Her fingers trembled as she slit it open with a paperclip Roy handed her. She began to read. Roy would not remember later exactly how long Claire sat there reading. He knew the light in the office window changed. He knew Danny went out and came back with 3 more cups of coffee. He knew a hearse pulled in for Mrs. Cortland's funeral at 10. And Beau Renner arrived, and Roy stepped out to help with the arrangements, and when he came back an hour later, Claire was still reading. She had read them in order. She had a small stack of opened letters on her left side and a taller stack of unopened ones on her right. Her cheeks were shining. Every so often she would set a letter down, cover her face for a moment, and pick up the next. Roy did not disturb her. Around 1 in the afternoon, she had read them all. She sat very still for a long time with her hands flat on the desk. Then she looked up at Roy. "He knew," she said. "He knew everything Diane had been telling me. Somebody told him at some point, and he never fought back. He never called her. He never wrote to me demanding I stop believing her. Do you know why?" "No, ma'am." "He said in one of the letters," she picked up a middle-dated one, the paper still soft with her thumbprint, "that he had learned a long time ago that when a person is convinced of something, you can't argue them out of it. You just have to be there and be who you actually are and hope they eventually see. He said he was going to keep on being who he actually was, and he was going to wait." Roy sat down across from her. "He was waiting for you, Mom. He waited 4 years. He waited on the ground he was standing on." She smiled at that, wet-eyed. "He wrote a letter after every time I turned him away. Every time I hung up the phone, every time I sent his birthday cards back, every time he heard about me from somebody in town and didn't call. He wrote it out, he put the date, he put it in the box. And he asked Danny to bring it to me only if he was gone, because he still believed, until the very end, that I might change my mind on my own. And then the letters wouldn't be necessary." She looked at Danny. "He was betting on me every single day," she said. "He was betting on me, and I never knew it." Danny couldn't answer. He nodded and looked at the floor. Bess whined softly. Claire reached down and put her hand on the old Labrador's head. "There's one more thing in here," she said. She reached back into the box and lifted out a small folded piece of paper that had been tucked into the corner beneath the last envelope. It was thicker than a letter. She unfolded it slowly. It was a hand-drawn map. The map was a rough sketch of the northeast corner of Millbrook Cemetery. Walter had drawn the old oak. He had drawn the row of Mendez lambs. He had drawn his own future headstone with a small square marking where his marker would stand. And behind that square, 4 paces east, he had drawn a small circle and written a single word inside it. Here, beside the word, he had drawn a stick figure of a dog with an X where the collar should be. Under the drawing, in the same careful, block-lettered hand as the envelopes, he had written a line that made Claire's fingers close on the paper. "For when you're ready. Not before." Claire looked up at Roy. "He buried something." Roy leaned across the desk and studied the map. 4 paces east of the stone. That's inside the plot boundary, Ma'am. That's on cemetery property. Is that legal, what he did? Roy thought about it a moment. Ma'am, in 22 years I have found a lot of small things buried in this cemetery by grieving people. Coins, wedding rings, baby teeth in tin cans. Once a bottle of moonshine I decided I hadn't seen. It's not legal, strictly speaking. Nobody ever complains. He handed the map back. You want to go dig? She hesitated. Not today, she said. I've had enough today. Whenever you're ready. She folded the map carefully and put it in the inside pocket of her coat. Thank you, she said. Both of you. She stood up. Bess got up too, joints creaking. Claire looked at Danny. Would you have dinner with me tonight? Wherever you eat. I want to hear about him, all of it, every story you have. Danny's eyes were very wet. Yes, ma'am. Not ma'am. Yes, Claire. That night, Claire sat across from Danny in a booth at the diner on Main Street, the one where the piece of paper about Bess had been taped in the window for so many weeks that it had started to yellow around the edges. Ellen Baird from the boarding house had recommended the diner and had said the meatloaf was the best in 3 counties. Claire ordered it because Ellen had told her to. Danny ordered a hamburger because that was what he always ordered. For 2 hours, she listened. Danny told her about the time Walter had climbed 60 feet into a rotten white ash and cut the top off it without a helmet because the customer couldn't afford the extra hour of insured labor. He told her about the way Walter drank his coffee, black, no sugar, from the same chipped mug that had a picture of a walleye on it that he refused to throw away even after the handle had been glued back on 3 times. He told her about the way Walter had insisted every single Christmas on hanging a strand of lights on the dogwood tree in his front yard, even though Danny had told him twice a year that the tree was going to have to come down. He told her about the last month. He told her about the diagnosis Walter had gotten in June, a small tumor in the pancreas, aggressive, not the sort of thing you fight for very long. He told her about the way Walter had refused chemotherapy. He told her that Walter had asked him, the only person Walter had asked, to please not tell Claire, because he did not want the last thing to happen between them to be a duty phone call. He wanted her to remember him the way he had been the last time she saw him, whenever that had been. Danny told her that Walter had died on a Tuesday morning in his own kitchen, at his kitchen table, with a cup of coffee in front of him, and Bess curled up at his feet. He told her he had found him there when he stopped by on his way in to work. He told her Walter had looked peaceful. He told her that was the truth. Claire cried through most of it, and Danny cried too, and by the end they had gone through half the napkins in the booth, and the waitress had left them alone, and outside on Main Street the lights had come on in the small shop windows. "I'm sorry," Danny said at one point. "I'm sorry I didn't come find you sooner. Don't apologize to me, Danny. I should have. You did what he asked. That's not a thing to apologize for. That's a thing to be thanked for." He nodded and pressed his fingers against his eyes. "I'm going to Columbus this weekend," Claire said. "To see somebody." "My Aunt Diane." Danny looked up. "I have to know," Claire said. "I have to know what she thought she was doing to me. I have to know why." Claire's Aunt Diane lived in a 2-story house on a cul-de-sac in Upper Arlington, one of those quiet, tidy streets where the leaves are raked into neat piles every Saturday and nobody's dog is allowed to bark past 9. Diane was 59 and had never married and worked as a legal secretary for a firm downtown. She had taken care of Claire's mother in the last months, and Claire had felt indebted to her ever since. Claire had called ahead. She had said only that she needed to talk. Diane opened the door in a beige cardigan and reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She had baked. Claire could smell it before she even stepped into the entryway. There was a lemon cake cooling on a wire rack in the kitchen and a pot of coffee already on the counter, and the whole house smelled the way houses smell when somebody has decided in advance that a difficult conversation is going to be smoothed over with sugar. Claire sat down at the kitchen table. Diane sat down across from her. Claire set a slim manila folder on the table between them. Inside, she had photocopied 5 of her father's letters, the 5 that dealt most directly with Diane. "What's that?" Diane said, though her voice had thinned in a way that suggested she already knew. "Letters from my father to me. Every letter he wanted to send after I stopped talking to him. Every letter he never sent. 37 of them, all told. He gave them to a young man named Daniel Foley to bring to me if he died before we spoke again. He did die before we spoke again. Danny brought them last week." The kitchen was very quiet. "He wrote about you, Aunt Diane. In several of them, he wrote about a conversation the 2 of you had the winter after Mama died. He wrote about what you said to him at Mama's grave. He wrote about the way you cried and told him you had always loved him, and the way he told you as gently as he knew how that he could not love you back that way, that he was still Mama's and always would be. He wrote that you left crying and that a week later I stopped taking his calls, and he was not stupid enough to think those 2 things were unrelated." Diane's face had gone grey. "He didn't have proof, though," Claire said. "He couldn't prove it. He never confronted you. He thought if he told me, I'd think he was trying to poison me against you the way he suspected you were poisoning me against him. So he wrote it down. Every letter. He wrote what you'd told me that week, every rumor, every little detail, and he waited to see how long it would take before I started to check the timing on my own." "Claire, please, you told me he had been seeing a woman before Mama was buried. There wasn't a woman, Aunt Diane. There was you at the grave telling him you loved him." Diane pressed both hands flat on the table. "Claire, please, I was grieving. Your mother was... You told me he was stealing from Mama's savings. There was no missing money. Danny went to the bank with me yesterday. Every dollar of it is still there. It's been there for 4 years. He never touched a cent of it. You told me he was a stranger. He was my father, and I lost him because I believed you." Diane put her face in her hands. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Outside, somebody 2 houses down started up a leaf blower, and its sound came in through the kitchen windows, very small and very far away. "I never meant it to go that far," Diane whispered. "Yes," Claire said quietly. "I think you did. Not maybe at the beginning, but you meant it after a while. You liked being the one I called on Sunday nights. You liked being the one who understood me. You liked what he lost." Diane didn't answer. Claire stood up. "I am not going to be cruel to you," Claire said. "I'm not going to shout. I'm not going to embarrass you in front of your neighbors. I'm going to leave. And I'm not going to call you again, Aunt Diane. Not ever. And I need you to understand that this is not a healthy line. It is not a boundary. It is not a wellness practice. It is a consequence. You cost me the last 4 years of my father's life. I do not have anything left to give you, and you have used up whatever you were owed." She picked up the folder. She walked out. Claire came back to Harmon Falls that Sunday evening, tired all the way to the bone, and she went straight to the boarding house on Maple Street and slept for 11 hours and did not dream. When she woke up, Bess was on the rag rug at the foot of the bed with her chin on Claire's shoe. "All right," Claire whispered to her. "All right, girl. We're all right." Bess's tail thumped twice against the wood floor. The dog had gotten thinner in the last few weeks. Ellen Baird, the boarding house widow, had noticed it. So had Roy, who had said nothing but had left an extra bowl of soft food on the office porch on Saturday and Sunday. Claire had not wanted to notice. She had spent a week trying not to notice, but that morning she noticed. Bess's ribs showed in a way they hadn't in October. The grey on her muzzle had climbed up over her eyes. Her back legs shook when she stood, and the stairs from Ellen's porch to the sidewalk were harder for her than they had been the week before. Claire took her to the veterinary clinic on the west side of town that Monday afternoon. The vet was a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Nell Rausch, who had known Walter and known Bess for a decade. She ran her hands slowly along Bess's sides. She looked at her gums. She listened to her heart, for a long time. "How old is she?" Dr. Rausch asked, though she already knew. 14 next spring. That's a good long life for a lab. Claire's throat closed. "How bad is it?" Dr. Rausch sat down on the tiled floor so that her face was level with Bess's, and she cupped the old dog's head in both hands. "Her kidneys aren't great," she said gently. "Her heart isn't great either. She's tired, sweetheart. She's been tired for a while, and I think the last few months she's been pushing through because she had some place to go every morning. Weeks, months, weeks, not many. I am so sorry, honey." Claire nodded and pressed her lips together, and Bess licked the side of her hand, and the small examining room was very quiet. That night, Claire sat on the porch of the boarding house with Bess against her leg, and she cried the way a person cries when a thing that has just been given back to them starts to be taken away. She thought about the letters. She thought about all the years of them. She thought about her father sitting alone in his kitchen, writing a letter that he knew he would not send. She thought about him watching her from the back row of a small community theater in Columbus. She thought about the way Danny had described him at the kitchen table on the last morning, cup of coffee in front of him, old Bess curled at his feet. She thought about how much she had already lost, and she thought about the map in her coat pocket. The next morning, before the sun was up, she called Roy Sims and told him she was ready. Roy met her at the side gate at 6:30 with a garden spade and a small camping shovel and a flashlight. Danny was already there. He had driven over as soon as Claire called him. Bess rode up the drive in the crook of Claire's arm because she could not make the walk anymore. At the graveside, Roy paced off 4 steps east of the headstone, then knelt down and pressed his hand against the ground. "Grass is a little thinner right here," he said. "Somebody dug this at some point." He began to cut a neat square in the turf with the spade. Danny helped him lift it back. Together they set to digging. The metal box was about a foot down. It was another olive-green ammunition box, the twin of the one Danny had carried out of his car 3 weeks earlier, only larger. When Roy lifted it out and set it on the grass, they could all see it was heavy for its size. Claire knelt down beside it. Bess pressed against her arm. Claire opened the lid. Inside was a folded canvas cloth. She unwrapped it slowly. Inside the canvas were 4 things. The first was a small framed photograph of Walter's late wife, Claire's mother, as a young woman, standing in a summer dress in front of a peach tree. Claire had never seen the photograph before. On the back, in her father's block-lettered hand, was written, "This was the day she said yes. I kept it in my glove box for 42 years. It belongs with you now." The second was a leather-bound journal, thick with entries, dated across almost 20 years. Claire opened it to the first page. It was a diary of the small, ordinary things, the trees Walter had climbed, the weather that day, the price of gasoline, a joke a customer had told him, the day Claire had graduated from high school. She wore her mother's earrings, and my God, she looked like her. The day her daughter had been born a state away, and no one had told him for 3 days. The third thing was a folded certificate. It was a paid-up plot deed for the spot in Millbrook Cemetery next to Walter's in Claire's name. The date on it was 2 years old. Under Claire's name, in the space where the deed asked for beneficiary, Walter had written, "For her to have when the time comes, so she does not have to worry." The fourth thing was a small envelope, thick with something round. Claire opened it. Inside was a silver dog tag on a worn leather cord. It was Bess's original tag from the breeder in Worcester, from when she had been 9 weeks old. Under the tag was a folded note in her father's hand. The note said, "I have kept this on my kitchen windowsill since the day you brought her home from college and cried and told me you could not keep her. I have looked at it every morning of the last 12 years. She was your dog, and she is your dog, and if you are reading this, please know that she stayed with me because you did too. Every day, in her. Take care of her the rest of the way. Then bury her here, where I am, so that when it's your turn, we are all three of us in the same place. Love, Dad." Claire could not read the note out loud. She handed it to Roy. Roy read it and set it back down carefully on the canvas. Bess put her nose against the tag on the ground, then against Claire's hand. Claire folded up around the old dog with both arms and pressed her face into the black fur, and for a long time nobody said anything. Bess lived 17 more days. She spent them mostly on the porch of the boarding house, in a patch of sun that came in through the windbreak of the neighbors' cedar trees around 11 in the morning. Claire had rented the room by the month. She had taken a leave of absence from her job in Columbus. She had told her boss it was a family matter, and her boss, who had known Claire for 8 years and had been to a funeral of her own that fall, had said, "Take whatever time you need. Come back when you come back." Ellen Baird, the widow who ran the boarding house, was a natural angel. She cooked chicken and rice for Bess twice a day and pretended she had made too much. She kept the porch swept. She fed the birds in the front yard because Walter had told her once, on the sidewalk outside the hardware store, that his old lab liked to watch the birds, and it was the closest thing to hunting she had left. Danny came by every evening after his shift at the warehouse. He sat on the porch with Claire and Bess and Ellen, and often he brought a paper bag from the diner, and none of them spoke very much. There was no need. Bess would rest her chin on Claire's foot, and every so often she would raise her head and look at the road as if she were waiting for a specific truck. And then she would put her head down again. On the last afternoon, Dr. Rausch drove over from the clinic in her own car. She did not want Bess to be in a strange room. She wanted her on the porch, in her patch of sun. Claire sat behind the dog with Bess's head cradled in her lap. Danny knelt beside them. Ellen stood at the door with a towel folded over her arm. Roy Sims had come too, in his work clothes, and he stood on the top step with his cap in his hand. Dr. Rausch spoke to Bess very softly. "Good girl," she said. "Good girl. Look what a good long life." Bess sighed, a slow, long sound like the one she had made every morning at the grave, and closed her eyes. Claire whispered, "Go find him." The last breath came a moment later. They buried Bess the next morning in the plot next to Walter's, where Walter had bought and paid for 2 years earlier so that Claire would not have to worry. Roy dug the small grave himself, refused any help. Danny made a wooden marker out of cedar in Ellen Baird's garage that night, and he burned Bess's name into it with a wood-burning pen he had bought from the hardware store below his room. The morning of the burial was cold and clear. The gravel path crunched under Claire's boots. The old iron gates gave their long, familiar complaint when Roy pushed them open. Bess was wrapped in an old horse blanket that had been in Walter's barn for 30 years. Claire put her father's dog into the ground with her own hands. She placed the leather cord and the silver tag around Bess's neck first. She placed the little framed photograph of her mother in the peach dress on top of the blanket. She placed her palm on Bess's back one last time. Then Roy covered the grave, and Danny said a few words that were mostly for himself. And Ellen Baird sang the first verse of a hymn her grandmother had sung to her as a child, quietly, only just above her breath. The three of them walked back down the gravel path together. At the gate, Claire stopped and turned around. The two graves lay side by side under the old oak in the northeast corner, in the sunrise light of the last week of November. She stood there a long time looking at them. Then she turned and walked out through the iron gate for the first time in 3 months without a dog beside her. The story of Bess did not stay in Harmon Falls. Somebody at the county paper wrote a longer piece for the Sunday edition, and a photographer from an outfit in Cleveland drove down to Millbrook and took a picture of the two markers side by side, and a version of the article ran online, and by Christmas it had been shared and shared again, until people were writing to Claire from Oregon and Georgia and Maine to say that they had cried at their kitchen tables reading it and would never look at their own dogs the same way. She wrote back to as many as she could. The diner on Main Street took down the yellowing photograph of Bess and framed it and hung it on the wall by the door. Somebody set a candle on Walter's grave every week for the whole winter, and Roy Sims never knew who did it, and he never asked. He suspected it was Ellen Baird. He suspected it was also sometimes a woman he had never met, who drove up in a car with Pennsylvania plates and left a small bunch of yellow flowers, and who Roy thought was probably a stranger who had read the article and needed a place to put down something of her own. He let her come. He let anybody come. That's what a cemetery is for. Aunt Diane wrote Claire a letter in December, a long one, and Claire read it once, folded it neatly, and burned it in the wood stove at Ellen Baird's boarding house without answering. She did not need Diane's apology. She had needed her father, and her aunt had cost her that, and no letter was going to buy it back. Some things you cannot undo. Some things a person has to live with, and Diane could live with it, and Claire wished her nothing at all, which was the most honest and the most terrible thing she had ever wished anybody. Diane's law firm in Columbus quietly let her go the following spring, when a discrepancy in a client's file, one of a much smaller order than she had accused Walter of, came to light. Roy read about it in the paper months later. He did not tell Claire. She would have said, if he had, that she did not care, and she would have meant it, and it would have almost been true. Claire did not go back to Columbus. She rented a small house on the edge of Harmon Falls, 3 streets over from where her father had lived, with a fenced yard and a dogwood tree in the front. She sold her apartment in Columbus in the spring. She took a job at the small law office in town, sorting files and drafting letters, much like the work Diane had done, only without the poison. And in the evenings, she walked the 2-mile loop out to Millbrook Cemetery and let herself in through the side gate with the key Roy had given her. She sat by her father and by Bess. She read out loud sometimes, passages from her father's journal, mostly, or letters she was writing him now, on her own paper, which she left for a night on the headstone and then took back inside her coat. Danny came to see her every Sunday. He mowed her yard in the summer without asking. She helped him fill out an application to community college in the fall. He got in. He was studying small engine repair with a side certificate in landscaping, and Walter's old customers, one by one, had begun calling him again to take down their storm-damaged trees. In April of that next year, when the dogwood in Claire's front yard came out white, she went to the county shelter and stood in front of a run at the very end of the aisle. Inside was a black lab mix, maybe 4 years old, with a graying muzzle and hips that were already going. The card on the run said the dog had been surrendered by a family whose grandfather had passed. Nobody in the family had a house big enough. Claire signed the paperwork that afternoon. She named the dog Sonny, because her father had once said in an entry in his journal that Bess had always been shadow-colored, and the next dog Claire ever brought home should be named for the light. 20 months after Roy Sims first found an old black Labrador waiting on the wrong side of his gate, he unlocked the iron pickets one September morning and stepped through and stopped and smiled to himself. 2 figures were making their slow way up the gravel path. One was Claire, in a canvas coat she had bought at the hardware store the year before. The other was Sonny, walking slowly beside her the way old dogs walk, one back leg first, then the other. They turned left at the old oak. They went past the Mendez lambs. They climbed the small slope to the northeast corner, and they stopped at the 2 headstones under the old tree, side by side. Roy watched them from the office porch. He thought about the very first morning. He thought about the frost on the gate. He thought about the sound Bess had made when she had lowered herself down on the ground beside Walter's stone. He thought about the shaking of Claire's shoulders that first Thursday. He thought about a small green metal box. He thought about a letter Walter had written on a night when Claire had hung up on him, and he had put down the phone and gone to the kitchen table and dated a piece of paper and started to write, believing that his daughter would come back, believing it all the way to the end. He thought about how long some kinds of love wait. He thought about the 4 miles Bess had walked on hips that were already going, following a scent that no vet had ever managed to explain, because she had known, the way animals know, that her person had been left in the ground, and she had a promise to keep to him that no one had ever asked her to make. He thought about how the whole town had come, in the end, to stand at the fence and watch her make that walk. He thought about the picture from the diner window. He thought about the candles that had appeared through the winter. He thought about a young man named Danny Foley, whom Walter had picked up out of a warehouse parking lot at 20, and who, that fall, was starting his 2nd year of community college with a certificate in small engine repair already framed on his mother's dresser in Zanesville. He thought about all of it, and he thought quietly, standing on his office porch with his cap in his hand, that some people are lucky enough to be waited for. Some people are lucky enough to be forgiven. Some people are lucky enough to be given, in the last hour, a second chance to lay their palm on a stone and say the thing they have been holding back for 4 years. And some old black dogs, on old bad hips, will walk 4 miles across a county in the dark, and they will sit by an iron gate until the man with the keys shows up, and they will teach a whole town what love without conditions looks like, and they will not ask so much as a bowl of water in return. Roy set his cap back on his head. He walked out to meet Claire and Sonny at the top of the path. He knelt down, slow because of his knees, and he put his palm on Sonny's broad greying head, and he said quietly, "Morning, girl." She wagged her tail once. Behind them, the sun came up over the flat farmland outside Harmon Falls, and the pickets of the old iron fence caught the light one by one, and somewhere down on Main Street, on a small yellowed photograph in the window of a diner that had never come down, a black lab with a grey muzzle sat on the wrong side of a gate and waited forever for a man to unlock it. If this story touched you the way it touched me, take a moment to give it a like. Tell me down in the comments about a loyal friend, human or otherwise, you have loved and lost. And if you're not already subscribed, come on and subscribe, because there are more stories like this one on the way, and you shouldn't miss a single one.